Colonel, for all the years that you've been on Capitol Hill and have met various people, whether in the Bush administration and beyond, who do you, who would you classify as, when people think about the swamp, when they think about the worst of what American politics has to offer, I've been very adamant that the worst of our American political system are the opportunistic people who will work on behalf of corporate interests. I'm talking about the David Frums of the world, the Jennifer Rubins of the world, the Bill Kristols of the world. These are people who never served our country. They only serve their pocketbook, and they are willing to send courageous people off to die in order to make their wallets bigger. I believe that those are the worst people in politics. Who would you say, based on your experiences, are the people that are causing so much of the plight that we're living through today and have only gotten progressively worse since you've been involved in politics?
Well, I would agree with the comments that you just made wholeheartedly, but I would add to that the fact that we have so many people now, not just the CEOs and COOs and VPs and such, but also some amongst the shareholders who are benefiting so majorly from these wars. I mean, they are literally making their millions from these wars, from being merchants of death. They scare me too. But back to your original comment there, I'm really concerned too about what we did with Citizens United. The allowing all this dark money to flow into all these political coffers with no accountability whatsoever has just polluted our political process and system and people. You're right. It's all about money now. And that's the reason you have 4 stars and 3 stars leaving all the services on Monday. And next week, they're working for Saudi Arabia for $600,000 a month, or they're working for Lockheed for $2 or $3 million just to attend 2 advisory board meetings. And they're making sure that what they did on the inside, buying the F-35, for example, remains a mainstay of the money that's being spent and earned by them in the company that they go to. This is unconscionable to me. I mean, Powell and I used to have some really nasty, poisonous words for the few that went through the so-called revolving door in our day. Now it's dozens of them. Most Americans don't know this. The man who ran the National Security Agency, General Keith Alexander, for 8 years, who did a lot of the things that we now look back on and that Edward Snowden revealed, we now look back on with some, fear, and we should, is working for Mohammed bin Salman. There's no law against that. Guess what he's doing for MBS, probably. You'll have to be a rocket scientist to figure that out.
Well, people will play both sides.
And yet Julian Assange is being charged with under the Espionage Act.
Good point. Excellent point.
Isn't that it's like a bizarro world. To me, that's so much more dangerous what you're talking about. And that's what happens. And yet the truth tellers are always the ones that get prosecuted.
Well, that's why I fear we're losing our republic. It's really going by the wayside. And I'm wondering, what is the motivation of somebody like a John Bolton or a Mike Pompeo? What is their motivation? Because they seem to be, we could take another hour talking about the CIA, but as far as I'm concerned, there is something to be said for people that are literally, there are people like the Bill Kristols and the Jennifer Rubins who they just want money. But then you get into people like John Bolton and Mike Pompeo.
They're bloodthirsty.
They're bloodthirsty. They want people to be dead. There is something to be said for that. I believe John Bolton is the worst person in all of politics. I believe he's a chicken hawk on top of everything else. But what is the motivation of somebody like him?
I don't do psychology very well.
I was going to say he's a psychopath. That's what
I will tell you this. I will second your view of John Bolton. I walked into his office when he was Undersecretary of State for International Security Affairs and Arms Control with Jim Kelly, who was the Assistant Secretary for East.
I know who Mr. Kelly is, yes.
We were very, very angry with John, and the Secretary wouldn't rebuke him, so we figured we were going to rebuke him. We got Rich Armitage, the deputy's permission to do so. He had just been testifying before the Congress and making public remarks that essentially went against even President Bush's policy at that point with regard to North Korea. And at the end of the conversation we were having with John, it was clear he wasn't paying much attention, and Jim Kelly's words were rolling off his back. I said something to the effect of, you do know that if we went to war, there are 250,000 American non-combatants in the greater Seoul metro area, and that many of them would be dead in the 30 or 40,000 casualties that occurred almost immediately, first 24 hours, if North Korea unleashed those cannons it has in the mountains just north of the DMZ. Even if they only fired 10 rounds each and then melted, still the devastation would be incredible. He looked at me and he said, knowing who I was, he said, I don't do war. That's your bailiwick. That's John Bolton. He was willing to risk a war with North Korea, and he was trying to provoke one.
That's not
he didn't care about the casualties.
No.
So if Donald Trump is this rogue Mussolini-like character that is basically going to throw a Molotov cocktail into the system, there are a lot of things that he did as president that made absolutely no sense. And the one that always made me scratch my head the most was, why was John Bolton literally at his side for a significant portion of his presidency? When people are looking around and saying, oh, I support Donald Trump because he's different than everybody else, you can't pick a bigger swamp dweller than John Bolton. And he didn't just pick him for anything. He picked him to literally dictate his foreign policy. There is no getting around that. We have a military-industrial complex that more or less runs our country, and especially runs our foreign policy. How is it that so many people are still having a hard time wrapping their head around that fact, especially when it comes to their unwavering support for Trump in his connection with Bolton?
Bolton and Trump are, in some ways, a mystery to me, but in other ways they aren't. I understood why Ronald Reagan had 6 national security advisors. I've made a close study of both administrations, first one and the second one. He had a very astute reason for having 6 national security advisors. He saw what happened with Jimmy Carter, and he saw what happened with Richard Nixon. They essentially had national security advisors who became presidents at various times, very important times, serious times with regard to national security. It's Big Brzezinski and Henry Kissinger. He didn't want that, so he had 6 different ones. That's the only way you can keep the national security advisor from accruing enough power to be injurious to you. I think Trump started out with that kind of idea. He took a lot of his lessons, if you will, in governing from Ronald Reagan.
Yeah.
And so a lot of the volatility of his national security advisors can be explained by that. But why he took on that particular one when there were other assholes, if you will, out there to pick on that weren't quite as bad, I don't know. I can't explain it. It didn't last long, though, you noted, and Bolton has been one of his fiercest critics ever since, because you can't wrong John and expect him not to spit back at you.
Thanks for watching. If you want to support our mission to transform politics into service, please like this video, subscribe, follow us on social media, and consider joining our Patreon, where you'll get early access to our interviews as well as other exclusive content. Links are in the description. Peace out.